In a crowded military hall, a young officer spots a simple badge on a woman's jacket. "This isn't even a proper military ID," he mocks, lifting it between two fingers before letting it drop. Laughter ripples through the room as more officers join in. "Probably some contractor who got lost." The woman remains eerily calm, checking her watch as if waiting for something. Then the doors burst open. Secret Service agents sweep inside, pushing everyone back, forming a protective circle around her. The mockery dies instantly. The young officer stands frozen as the truth dawns. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoyed this story about misjudgment and hidden authority, please consider subscribing for more powerful narratives about the moments that change us forever. Fort Blackwood Joint Operations Center buzzed with activity. Personnel from every military branch converged for the classified joint exercise briefing, their uniforms adorned with ribbons, patches, and insignias that announced their status and achievements to anyone who cared to look. Major Alaric Thorne cared, but not in the way most did. She moved through the crowded hall with deliberate calm, her civilian attire and simple unmarked badge a stark contrast to the military pageantry around her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical style that hadn't seen a salon in months, and her eyes sharp, assessing moved continuously, cataloging details most would miss. This wasn't her first time being invisible in plain sight. In fact, she preferred it. Ensign Farron Riker, however, was not accustomed to being overlooked. Third-generation Navy, top of his class at Annapolis, and recently assigned to Naval Intelligence, Riker wore his ambition as prominently as the perfectly polished insignia on his immaculate uniform. His grandfather had been an admiral, his father was a captain, and Riker had no intention of breaking the family tradition of excellence. Excellence, in Riker's world, meant never letting protocol breaches slide. "Sir," he approached Lieutenant Commander Davos with a deferential nod. "There appears to be a civilian in the briefing area." He gestured discreetly toward Alaric, who was reviewing something on her tablet in the front row. Davos glanced over, frowning slightly. "Probably an analyst or contractor. They're everywhere these days." "In the command staff seating?" Riker pressed, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby officers. "With only a visitor's badge?" Several heads turned. Davos shrugged, already losing interest. "Not my department, Ensign." Riker straightened his shoulders. If his superior wouldn't address this breach of protocol, he would. After all, securing classified information was every officer's responsibility. He approached Alaric with the exaggerated courtesy he reserved for lost tourists and confused contractors. "Ma'am," he said, his voice pleasant but raised just enough to be heard by those around them. "I believe you may be confused about the seating arrangements. Those chairs are reserved for command staff only." He gestured to her badge. "I can see from your credentials that you're probably from logistics or analytics. The observer section is in the back." A few nearby officers chuckled. Lieutenant Nazari from Army Intelligence smirked openly. Even Commander Wexler, a stern woman not known for humor, raised an eyebrow in amusement. Alaric looked up from her tablet, her gaze meeting Riker's. For a brief moment, something flashed in her eyes, not embarrassment or confusion as he expected, but something else. Something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Then it was gone, replaced by a neutral expression. "Thank you for your concern, Ensign," she said simply, her voice quiet but clear. She didn't move. Riker felt a flush of irritation, acutely aware of the eyes on them. This woman was making him look ineffective. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a tone that suggested he was doing her a favor. "With all due respect, that civilian ID badge doesn't grant you access to classified operational briefings. I'm actually doing you a favor before security notices." More officers had turned to watch now. The pre-briefing chatter diminished as attention shifted to this minor drama. Alaric remained seated, her composure intact as she checked her watch briefly. "Perhaps you didn't hear me," Riker continued, emboldened by the audience. "This section is for—" "Is there a problem here, Ensign?" Commander Zephyr Blackwood, grandson of the fort's namesake and Riker's direct superior, approached with the confident stride of someone who had never questioned his place in a room. His family had been military royalty for generations, and it showed in everything from his bearing to the custom-made uniform that fit his athletic frame perfectly. "Sir," Riker straightened, "I was just explaining to this civilian that she's in a restricted seating area." Blackwood surveyed Alaric with the casual dismissiveness of someone accustomed to having his assessment of others accepted without question. His gaze lingered on her badge. "He's right," Blackwood said, not addressing Alaric directly. "This is a secure briefing for combat personnel. Your civilian clearance badge doesn't qualify for this section." Riker, feeling vindicated and secure in his superior's backing, reached forward and lifted Alaric's badge between two fingers, as if it might contaminate him. "This isn't even a proper military ID," he announced, letting it drop back against her jacket. "No rank, no unit designation, probably some contractor who got lost." A circle had formed around them now. Lieutenant Commander Jericho joined in. DOD pencil pusher, most likely. They're always wandering where they shouldn't be. "Cafeteria inspector with aspirations," suggested another officer, generating more laughter. "Maybe she's from the janitorial staff," called out a captain from the back. "Wanted to see how the real military operates." Through it all, Alaric remained calm, her expression betraying nothing beyond mild interest, as if she were observing a mildly entertaining but ultimately insignificant spectacle. Only the slight tightening of her jaw suggested she heard them at all. From the edge of the group, Lieutenant Colonel Imara Sarhan watched with growing discomfort. 20 years in military intelligence had given her a finely tuned sense for when something wasn't right, and something about this scenario felt off. "Ridley," she murmured to her colleague, "does this feel strange to you?" Colonel Ridley frowned. "What do you mean?" "Nobody stays that calm under this kind of pressure, not civilians. They get flustered, defensive, or they retreat. She's just waiting." Before Ridley could respond, Riker delivered what he clearly thought would be his final word on the matter. "Listen, lady, this badge might get you into the gift shop, but this is where actual warriors plan actual missions. So unless you've got something better than that civilian ID, I suggest you—" The double doors at the entrance slammed open, the sound cutting through the room like a gunshot. 6 men in dark suits entered with coordinated precision, their movements fluid but unmistakably purposeful. Secret Service agents, their earpieces and alert postures announcing their identity as clearly as any uniform. Without a word, they began systematically clearing the space around Alaric, pushing back even senior officers with firm but respectful pressure. "Everybody back, now!" The lead agent's voice cut through the sudden silence. The military personnel, including senior officers, found themselves pressed against the walls, confusion rippling through the crowd as the Secret Service agents formed a protective circle around the woman they had just been mocking. Riker stood frozen, his face draining of color as the implications began to dawn on him. The woman they had dismissed as nothing was the one the Secret Service had been sent to protect. The main doors opened again. This time, the entire room stiffened to attention. General Orion Lockhart, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, entered with the easy confidence of a man who had spent decades commanding rooms far more intimidating than this one. His presence, unexpected and unannounced, sent a silent shockwave through the assembled officers. The general ignored everyone, walking directly to Alaric Thorne, who had risen from her seat. "Major Thorne," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silent room, "I apologize for the delay. The President is waiting for your assessment before authorizing the operation." Riker felt as if the floor had suddenly tilted beneath him. Major Thorne? The civilian he had just publicly humiliated outranked him by several grades. But that wasn't the worst of it, not by far. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs had just mentioned the President waiting for her assessment. General Lockhart turned to address the room, his expression stern but composed. "For those of you who haven't been briefed, this is Major Alaric Thorne. She commanded Operation Shadowfall last year." A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the room. Operation Shadowfall was classified to the highest levels, but its existence and its legendary success had filtered down through the ranks in whispers and rumors. 3 hostages extracted from deep within hostile territory, a terrorist cell dismantled, and 0 American casualties. The team that pulled it off was spoken of with reverence, though most details remained shrouded in secrecy. "That's still classified," Lockhart continued, silencing the whispers with a glance. "But what I can tell you is that the President has personally requested her to lead this joint task force." The room fell into stunned silence as the reality sank in. The civilian ID wasn't a civilian badge at all. It was a specialized clearance marker for an ultra-classified program that operated outside normal military channels. Lockhart's gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on Riker and Commander Blackwood. Major Thorne will be selecting her team personally for this operation. I suggest you all remember that credentials come in many forms. The general stepped aside, yielding the floor to Major Thorne. She moved to the podium with quiet efficiency, no trace of triumph or vindication in her bearing. Only now did Riker notice the way she carried herself, the economy of movement, the balanced stance, the situational awareness that marked veterans of high-risk operations. How had he missed it? How had they all missed it? As Alaric arranged her materials on the podium, Riker remained frozen in place, his mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. His career aspirations, his family legacy, his future in naval intelligence, all potentially destroyed by his own arrogance. Alaric finally looked up, her gaze sweeping the room before briefly meeting Riker's eyes. She didn't gloat or threaten, she simply acknowledged him with a slight nod that somehow felt more devastating than any reprimand could have been. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and authoritative, "I'll be brief. Operation Kingfisher involves extraction of a high-value intelligence asset from a hostile environment with significant counterintelligence presence." She activated the display screen, showing a complex tactical map. "Our insertion point will be compromised within 72 hours. The extraction window is narrow, and the consequences of failure are unacceptable." For the next 20 minutes, Alaric delivered a precise, authoritative assessment of the mission parameters. Her presentation demonstrated not just an exceptional tactical mind, but the depth of field experience that came only from years of high-risk operations. She spoke the language of someone who had faced death on multiple continents and returned with the lessons only that teacher could impart. "This operation requires specific skill sets," she concluded. "Technical expertise, language proficiency, and combat experience under extreme conditions. But more importantly, it requires something that doesn't appear on any service record." Her gaze swept the room again. "It requires the ability to set aside ego, to adapt instantly to changing conditions, and to recognize that sometimes the most important person in the room isn't wearing stars on their shoulders or medals on their chest." The briefing concluded with General Lockhart providing final authorization details. As the room began to clear, officers lined up to introduce themselves to Major Thorne, each hoping to be selected for her team. Commander Blackwood was conspicuously absent, having made a discreet exit immediately after the briefing. Riker remained where he stood, unable to join the line of officers seeking Thorne's attention, equally unable to slink away unnoticed. He watched as she spoke briefly with each officer, her manner professional and focused. When the room had cleared except for Riker and the ever-present Secret Service agents, Alaric approached him. He snapped to rigid attention, his face a careful mask hiding the turmoil beneath. "Ensign Riker," she said, her tone neutral. "Major Thorne," he responded, his voice tight. "I wish to formally apologize for my behavior earlier. It was unprofessional, disrespectful, and—" "Your file," she interrupted, "indicates you have specialized training in cryptographic systems. Is that accurate?" The question caught him completely off guard. "Yes, ma'am. Advanced encryption protocols and counter-intrusion methodologies." "Including Devillian framework architecture?" Riker blinked in surprise. Devillian was a cutting-edge system few were cleared to know about, let alone work with. "Yes, ma'am. I was part of the beta testing team at Quantico last year." Alaric nodded, as if confirming something she already knew. "Then I expect you in the tactical room at 0600 tomorrow. This operation needs your skills, not your assumptions." Riker stared at her, unable to process what he was hearing. "Ma'am? Was I unclear, Ensign?" "No, ma'am. 0600 hours." He hesitated, then pressed on, needing to say it. "Major Thorne, I deeply apologize for my behavior earlier. It was inexcusable and—" "Do you know why I wear this badge, Ensign?" she interrupted, touching the simple identifier that had been the source of so much derision. "Because in my line of work, the people who advertise their importance are usually the least effective." Her eyes held his. "Remember that lesson." She turned to leave, then paused. "And Riker, don't be late." The tactical room buzzed with focused energy as Riker arrived at 0545 the next morning, determined to be early rather than merely on time. He was surprised to find Major Thorne already present, conferring quietly with a civilian in an expensive suit who appeared to be from some intelligence agency. Several other officers were already stationed at various workstations, each absorbed in their specific tasks. Lieutenant Colonel Sarhan, the woman who had noted Alaric's unusual calmness during yesterday's confrontation, was reviewing satellite imagery with a steely-eyed focus. "Ensign Riker," Alaric acknowledged his arrival without looking up from her tablet. "Station 3. We need a full cryptographic vulnerability assessment of these communication protocols." He moved to the designated station, logging in to find a complex set of encryption algorithms waiting for his analysis. This was serious, high-level work, far beyond what ensigns were typically assigned. Was this a test, a chance to redeem himself? Or was she setting him up for failure? For the next 12 hours, Riker lost himself in the work, finding unexpected weaknesses in what appeared to be an impenetrable system. When he finally looked up, rubbing his burning eyes, he found Major Thorne standing behind him, silently reviewing his findings. "Good work," she said simply. "You found the decoy vulnerability in the third protocol layer." "Decoy, ma'am?" "A trap designed to occupy counterintelligence resources while the real communication happens elsewhere." She gestured to his screen. "But you also found the secondary weakness in the carrier wave modulation. Not many would have caught that." It was a genuine compliment, offered without embellishment. Coming from someone of her reputation, it carried weight. "Thank you, ma'am." "Get some rest. Briefing at 0400. We deploy tomorrow." The next 3 days were a blur of preparation, strategy sessions, and equipment checks. Riker found himself part of an 8-person team, each selected for specific expertise. Besides him, there was Lieutenant Colonel Sarhan for intelligence analysis, Captain Quillen for medical support, Lieutenant Nazari, who had smirked during Riker's confrontation with Thorne, now handling communications, and 4 special operations personnel whose backgrounds were clearly classified beyond Riker's clearance level. Commander Blackwood was nowhere to be seen, having been notably absent from all mission preparations. The rumor mill suggested he had requested a transfer to a naval station in Alaska, effective immediately. As the team prepared for deployment, Riker observed Major Thorne's leadership style with growing respect. She was demanding but never demeaning, decisive without being dictatorial, and possessed a calm certainty that inspired confidence, even as they prepared for what was clearly a high-risk operation. Most striking was the loyalty she commanded from the Special Operations team. These hardened veterans, who typically viewed officers with barely concealed disdain, treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence. They followed her orders without question, not from fear or regulation, but from a deep trust that she would never waste their efforts or risk their lives unnecessarily. On the evening before deployment, Riker found Thorne alone in the planning room, reviewing contingency protocols for the 5th time. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am?" She looked up, one eyebrow slightly raised. "Granted." "Why did you select me for this team? There are dozens of cryptographers with more experience, higher clearance levels, and without the complication of our first meeting." Thorne set down her tablet, giving him her full attention. "3 reasons, Ensign. First, your technical skills are exceptional. Your handling of the Devillian architecture proved that." Riker nodded, waiting for her to continue. "Second, your background check shows a pattern of complete honesty in after-action reports, even when admitting mistakes that could have damaged your record." That surprised him. He'd always considered those honest reports to be professional obligations, not special virtues. "And third?" he asked when she paused. "Third," she said, her gaze direct, "is what I saw in your eyes yesterday." "Ma'am?" "When the reality of the situation hit you, I saw genuine shame. Not embarrassment at being caught or fear for your career, but actual shame at having misjudged and mistreated another person." She picked up her tablet again. "That's surprisingly rare, Ensign Riker, especially among those with ambition." Riker absorbed this assessment, feeling both seen and challenged by it. "Get some sleep," Thorne added, returning to her work. "Where we're going, clear thinking will matter more than any encryption protocol." The mission began at 0300 the next morning with a halo jump into territory that, according to official records, no American military personnel were authorized to enter. What followed was 5 days of the most intense, demanding work Riker had ever experienced. Their objective was to extract a deep cover intelligence asset who had uncovered critical information about an imminent attack on American interests. The complication was that counterintelligence forces had already begun closing in, forcing the team to adapt constantly as extraction routes were compromised. Throughout it all, Major Thorne led with the same calm efficiency she had displayed in the briefing room. When their primary extraction point was suddenly swarming with hostile forces, she adapted the plan without hesitation. When communications were jammed, she implemented contingency protocols that kept the team functioning. And when Lieutenant Nazari, the same officer who had smirked during Riker's confrontation with Thorne, took a bullet in the shoulder during an unexpected firefight, it was Thorne who provided cover fire while simultaneously calling in coordinates for emergency extraction. By the fourth day, Riker had seen enough to understand why Operation Shadowfall had become the stuff of whispered legend. Major Alaric Thorne wasn't just good at her job, she redefined what the job could accomplish. On the fifth day, as they approached their secondary extraction point with the intelligence asset in tow, disaster struck. What they had believed to be an abandoned industrial complex turned out to be an active operations center for the very forces they were evading. Within moments, they were pinned down by heavy fire from multiple directions. "Quillen, status on Nazari?" Thorne's voice remained steady in their comms despite the bullets striking the concrete barriers shielding them. "Stable but critical," came the terse reply from the team medic. "He needs evac within 30 minutes or we risk losing him." Riker watched Thorne process this information, her eyes scanning their surroundings, calculating options that seemed increasingly limited. "Lieutenant Colonel Sarhan, take Specialist Okafor and move the asset through the eastern corridor. There's a drainage tunnel that should provide cover to the secondary extraction point. Captain Quillen, prepare Nazari for immediate transport." Her gaze fell on Riker. "Ensign, I need communications back online. The jamming signal is originating from the north building. We need to neutralize it so we can call in our extraction." Riker nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. Someone would need to cross 70 meters of exposed ground to reach that building, carrying the countermeasures equipment that might disable the jamming technology. "I'll go, ma'am," he said without hesitation. Thorne studied him for a beat. "We'll provide covering fire from 3 positions. Move fast, stay low, and remember your training." What followed was the longest 90 seconds of Riker's life, sprinting across open ground while bullets kicked up dirt around him, clutching equipment worth more than his annual salary, knowing that one misstep would mean failure for the entire mission. The team's coordinated covering fire kept the worst of the enemy response at bay, but not all of it. Riker was 15 meters from the north building when he felt the searing heat of a bullet grazing his jawline. The impact spun him sideways, blood instantly streaming down his neck, but he kept moving. Reaching the building, he slammed against the wall, gasping for breath as he fumbled with the countermeasures equipment. His hands were shaking, but his training held. Within 40 seconds, he had the device operational, targeting the specific frequency ranges used by the enemy's jamming technology. 10 seconds later, their comms crackled back to life. "Extraction point confirmed," came Thorne's voice in his earpiece. "Everyone converge on the secondary LZ in 4 minutes." Riker started to move when he heard Specialist Quillen's urgent transmission. "Hostile forces converging on my position. Nazari is non-ambulatory. We're pinned down in the western loading bay." Without thinking, Riker changed direction. The extraction window was closing. The majority of the team was already moving toward the LZ with the high-value asset, and protocol dictated that the mission objective took priority over individual team members. But Riker couldn't forget how Thorne had treated Nazari after the firefight, with the same care and concern she would have shown her oldest friend, despite his earlier mockery of her. "Quillen, this is Riker. Hold position. I'm coming to you." "Negative, Ensign," Thorne's voice cut in. "Proceed to extraction." Riker paused, the blood from his facial wound now soaking the collar of his tactical gear. "With respect, ma'am, we don't leave our people behind. Isn't that the lesson here?" There was a brief silence before Thorne responded. "Acknowledged. I'm doubling back to your position. Sarhan, get the asset to extraction. That's an order." What happened next would later be described in classified after-action reports as a textbook extraction under extreme duress. The reality was far messier. Riker reached Quillen and the wounded Nazari just as a new wave of hostile forces began closing in. Together, they attempted to move the injured communications officer, but it was slow going. They were still 30 meters from the extraction point when the enemy fire intensified. Quillen took a bullet to the leg, collapsing beside Nazari. Riker found himself alone, trying to shield two wounded teammates as the extraction helicopter's rotors became audible in the distance. Then suddenly Major Thorne was there, seemingly materializing from the chaos. Together, they created a makeshift stretcher from tactical gear and began the final push toward extraction. 10 seconds until we lose our window, the pilot's voice warned over comms. We'll make it, Thorne replied with such certainty that Riker found himself believing it despite the evidence of his eyes. They were still 5 meters from the helicopter when the largest volley yet of enemy fire erupted around them. Riker felt something slam into his back, knocking him forward. Not a bullet, he realized as he regained his footing, but Thorne, who had physically shoved him toward the waiting helicopter while positioning herself between the incoming fire and their wounded teammates. The last thing Riker saw before the extraction team pulled them all aboard was Major Thorne, firing with controlled precision, her face as calm as it had been in that briefing room that now seemed a lifetime ago. 6 months later, Fort Blackwood's ceremonial hall was transformed. Where once there had been rows of chairs for briefings, now there stood a formal arrangement for a commendation ceremony. The room gleamed with polished brass and the crisp lines of dress uniforms. Ensign Farron Riker stood at parade rest alongside 7 other team members, his posture perfect, but his expression markedly different from the cocky, self-assured officer of 6 months prior. The changes weren't just in his bearing, they were etched in the new scar along his jawline, in the watchful assessment that had replaced his previous swagger, and in the way he positioned himself slightly off-center, as if the spotlight was the last place he wanted to be. At the front of the formation stood Major Alaric Thorne, her uniform adorned with the insignia and decorations she had earned but rarely displayed. Even now, receiving commendation for an operation whose details would remain classified for decades, she appeared uncomfortable with the attention. General Lockhart approached the podium, his voice solemn as he addressed the small, select audience of high-ranking officials and family members. The operation we recognize today cannot be described in detail. The locations cannot be named. The lives saved cannot be counted publicly. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the team. But make no mistake, what these 8 individuals accomplished under Major Thorne's leadership has altered the course of international security in ways that will echo for generations. One by one, each team member was called forward to receive their commendation. When Riker's name was announced, he moved with precise steps to stand before the general. Ensign Farron Riker, Lockhart read, for exceptional technical expertise under extreme duress, and for actions above and beyond the call of duty during the critical extraction phase of the operation, you are awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Combat Distinguishing Device. As Riker received his medal, his eyes briefly met Thorne's. In that moment passed an understanding that transcended words, an acknowledgement of how far he had come, how much he had learned, and how differently he now saw the world. After the ceremony, as the small crowd dispersed into groups for subdued celebration, Riker found himself alone near the refreshment table. The past 6 months replayed in his mind, the grueling preparation, the harrowing insertion into hostile territory, the moment when everything went catastrophically wrong, and Major Thorne's unflappable leadership that had brought them all home alive. Congratulations, Ensign. He turned to find Major Thorne beside him, a glass of water in her hand. Thank you, ma'am, but we both know I was just doing my job. A faint smile touched her lips. Funny how perspective changes, isn't it? Riker nodded, understanding the multiple layers of her observation. He hesitated, then asked the question that had been bothering him for months. Major, I never asked why did you select me for the team after what I did. Thorne studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Because good leaders don't select people who never make mistakes, Ensign. Her gaze was steady. They select people who learn from them. Riker absorbed this, feeling the weight of the lesson. I'd like to think I have, ma'am. You have, she confirmed. Not everyone would have gone back for Specialist Quillen and Lieutenant Nazari under those circumstances. Riker's hand unconsciously touched the scar on his jaw, a permanent reminder of the moment he'd chosen to risk everything to ensure no one was left behind. Anyone on the team would have done the same. Perhaps, Thorne agreed. That's the point of building the right team. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Riker gestured to her badge, now replaced with her full military identification and security clearance. "I've been meaning to ask that badge you wore that day. It seemed personal, somehow." Thorne's expression shifted subtly, a shadow of something deeper crossing her face. "It belonged to my mentor," she said after a pause. "Major Alara Kessian. She died saving her team during an operation no one will ever hear about." Her fingers brushed the spot where the simple badge had once rested. "She taught me that true authority comes from actions, not insignias." The admission, rare from someone as private as Thorne, wasn't lost on Riker. "Thank you for sharing that, ma'am." Thorne nodded once, then seemed to mentally shift back to the present. "Your transfer to Naval Special Warfare Development Group has been approved, by the way. You report to Commander Holloway next month." Riker's eyes widened slightly. DevGru, informally known as SEAL Team 6, was among the most elite units in the military. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll remember what you learned here," Thorne replied. "About judgment, about humility, about the nature of true leadership." "I will, ma'am." As she turned to leave, Thorne paused and looked back. "And Riker? Next time you see someone with an unusual badge, maybe consider the possibility that they've earned every bit of authority they carry, even if they don't advertise it." Riker watched her walk away, finally understanding the full weight of the lesson he'd learned about judgment, humility, and the quiet power of those who never ask for recognition but deserve it more than anyone else. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone whose quiet competence spoke louder than any medal or title? Share your experience in the comments and subscribe to see more stories about the hidden heroes walking among us.